it's important for international networks to be established. It's important for international relations between nations to exist. The World Bank and the IMF have traditionally been very involved on the African continent in terms of structural adjustment packages in the 80s and 90s. The reserves are no longer required to be deposited at the French Treasury, but that was actually modified so that the BCAO, so that the central bank of that region would retain the reserves. So I think it is important to understand that debt statistics seem worse in the context of many African countries because of the way that those metrics are interpreted.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the Unpopular Opinion podcast. As we all know, African countries gained their political independence decades ago, but international financial and economic policies continue to shape their economies through Western-led institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, so much that Thomas Sankara warned us in the 80s that debt is a neo-colonialism. He went further to accuse Western-led institutions' technical assistance towards African countries as dictating to African policy. Today, sub-Saharan African countries' debt hovers around 27% of their GDP. Was Thomas Sankara right? Joining me to discuss China versus West and rethinking Africa's development is Dr. 𝐊𝐶𝐘𝐒. Her research focused on development, trade, finance, as well as BRICS and investigating Chinese financing of public infrastructures across Africa. Dr. 𝐊𝐶𝐘𝐒, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It is really an exciting opportunity for us to have you. I want us to set the basis with, are the Chinese loan any different from Western aid, or is just a new name with the same game of exploitation? And how can African countries truly break away from this game of exploitation by great powers?
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I think the question you ask is a very interesting one, and a very important one in the context of international policymaking from the perspective of African countries, or indeed any countries in the developing part of the world. I think what is important to recognize is that foreign aid and concessional lending extended from any country, if it is from the state, must be seen in the context of a broader foreign policy instrument. So if there's debt coming from the States, if there's debt coming from European countries, if there's debt coming from Asian countries, this debt extended by the state would be done so within the context of furthering the national ambitions of the country that is extending it. So there are many instruments that are used in this wider context. The so-called West, as we clump them together, but generally speaking, European countries and the United States have spent an enormous amount of time in terms of categorizing specifically what constitutes trade facilitation, what constitutes foreign aid, what constitutes concessional financing. I think where the discrepancy perhaps came in is when China started to become a more significant actor than previously on the African continent in particular, and this would have been in the mid-2000s. There was a lot of confusion because China's foreign policy instruments in the context of foreign aid and trade facilitation did not fit neatly into the categories that had previously been described. This doesn't mean that they are necessarily, they would be different. Let's put it this way. They would be different in terms of the strict categorization, but it is effectively a similar instrument being extended in a different way. That's not to say that it is in itself exploitative. I think the key here for African countries in considering any kind of partnership that is entered into with international partners, because we have seen that it's important for international networks to be established. It's important for international relations between nations to exist. What is important is due consideration for the criteria under which these flows or these agreements are made and extended. So understanding what constitutes so-called tied aid, what constitutes concessional lending, under what terms is the lending considered concessional, and considering the agreement in a much more holistic concept than merely the flow of funds from one country to another. Because in any context, from any country, flows that are accepted without due consideration and examination of the impact can be exploitative. So it's not necessarily the country from which the flows come, but the context and the circumstances under which they arrive. And I think that's a very, very key consideration in terms of selecting partners and in terms of selecting the context and the circumstances under which such flows are welcomed.
Thank you so much. I want us to dive into this a bit. If you check the record, it says that 64% of African countries' debt are owned by Western institutions through IMF. And if you just do your mathematical calculation, you observe that just less amount of debt from Africa are owned by China. But we often hear about debt trap policy, especially when it comes to Chinese dealing with Africans. Can we say this is just a smoke screen, or it's just a hypocrisy when it comes to people advocating for the West China-West debate?
So it's a good question. I think it's important, even though the IMF and the World Bank are traditionally considered to be largely Western countries, it is important to understand that China, along with many other Asian nations, are members of both of those institutions. I think where it becomes, where there is perhaps a difference in approach, is that European countries in particular, combined with the US, they enjoy the multilateral approach and the ability to standardize the way that certain aid, trade, or investment packages are structured. And I would expect that this is partly to ensure that there is a level playing field among all of these actors. China traditionally, although this approach has evolved somewhat over the last decade or so, China traditionally preferred bilateral engagements because the Chinese government was of the opinion that a bilateral engagement was far more enriching in terms of developing relations with the country with whom that bilateral agreement was extended. It was easier access, perhaps. It was thought that the influence would be greater, and there would be a far stronger halo effect, as it were, on a singular country, i.e. China, in terms of the benefits that package may render. Whereas that effect is diluted somewhat by the IMF, because the IMF is a multilateral body. So it is seen as faceless, as it were, in the sense of belonging to a particular nation state. So it's merely a difference. One must be very careful in terms of trying to compare multilateral organizations with bilateral agreements, because all the members of the IMF would have many of the members of the IMF would have bilateral agreements with a country as well. So I think that it's probably a difference of approach in terms of how these packages are extended. The World Bank and the IMF have traditionally been very involved on the African continent in terms of structural adjustment packages in the 80s and 90s, and later standby agreements and various sort of debt packages in the case of sovereign distress. So there is a long history there. China was very involved in the 50s and 60s, withdrew somewhat in the 80s and 90s, and then came back with quite a force in the early 2000s. But this does seem to be moderating, as it were. I think it is important, though, when we're comparing the source of debt, number one, to make sure that we're comparing apples with apples in terms of bilateral versus multilateral engagement, and also to understand what that debt supports, because debt in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. there is productive debt, so debt that is taken on to increase the production, to increase the output of the economy, to increase GDP. It's the trouble comes in when debt is taken on for non-generative projects, or projects that are not actually seen to either be able to pay back the debt that was taken on to fund them, or indeed to generate revenue outside of the debt repayment. So again, we must just be very careful about understanding what the debt is for and whether it is productive, or as is often unfortunately the case, whether it is merely a burden on the state fiscus without actually generating any revenue.
Based upon what you said, I want us to look at France and also China. France has been accused of controlling about 14 countries' economies in West Africa. Those countries that are former colonies, where their national reserve is being kept at the central bank in France, and the CFA is printed in Lyon. China is also, on the other hand, is asking its partners across the African continent, where if there's a default on the payment of debt, we are going to see specific part of or specific infrastructure in your country, like it happened in Uganda, where they are owning the airport right now due to the default in payment. So can you please tell us the difference between these two countries in terms of debt management?
It's a very interesting comparison. I would maybe say on a general level, France has very much financial infrastructural engagement with the countries that you mentioned, whereas China is much more project finance. So if we look in the case of France, there are actually two monetary zones in West Africa. Both are the CFA. The one is called ZOF and the other one is called ZAF, but they're both pegged 1-to-1 to the euro. And it's very interesting because effectively this monetary union was put together after the end of World War II. At that time, many of these countries were still colonies of France and would only become independent 15 to 20 years later. And it's very interesting that, funnily enough, this peg was actually deleterious to these economies, not because the economies were doing badly, but because France, post-World War II, went into economic decline. And the strength of the pegged currency relative to these other countries that were very much agricultural based and needed to get their exports out was very corrosive, because their exports were actually too expensive relative to the currency that was underutilization in these countries. So the CFA was actually it was devalued in order to actually rebase it appropriately to these countries. And it's interesting now because the debate many decades later is still coming up, is still quite contentious. The only other time that the CFA was devalued was in 1994, after the death of President of the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Houphouët-Boigny. He was a strong advocate to retain the value of the CFA, and it was only upon his death that it was devalued again to rebase it to an appropriate level for these countries, after which it's been pegged to the euro. Now you have countries who within this union have made quite strong movements, saying that they want to extract themselves from French influence, that they want to be removed from the monetary union. But then you have others who recognize the benefit, because effectively within the monetary union, because of the peg to the euro, they have experienced a very low inflationary environment over the last 25 years, which has been hugely beneficial to economic growth. So there are swings and roundabouts to all of these arrangements. And while there is very much a residual tie to the French Treasury, incidentally now the reserves are no longer required to be deposited at the French Treasury, but that was actually modified so that the BCAO, so that the central bank of that region would retain the reserves. But it's very interesting that even though responsibility for maintenance of the reserves was devolved from the French Treasury to the BCAO still has very strict policies in terms of how those countries may spend their foreign reserves, what they're permitted to do and what they are not permitted to do. So it's really very much a case of swapping out some sovereign autonomy for the relative stability that the monetary union provides to the collective. And it's a very interesting dynamic to see how that has evolved over time. In the case of the Chinese loans, in many cases, these, particularly in the early years, because of the cost of the financing, many of these loans were considered to be concessional. But the reason why the cost was lower is because in many cases they were collateralized. So I don't know the details of the loan that you're referring to in Uganda, but it does sound very much like when the legal agreements for this financial arrangement were put together, that there was a collateralization clause which stipulated that if there was a failure to pay or an event that constituted non-payment, then the Chinese entity that was the lender of record for that loan would be entitled to seize certain portions of infrastructure. Now, of course, this sounds very draconian, but it would have been, if this is the case, and again, I must underline that I don't know the details of this loan, but if this is the case, and this is how that loan was collateralized, that is the risk that the Ugandan sovereign state would have entered into in terms of entering into this financial contract. So perhaps the lure of the lower financing was interesting, but again, as with all financial contracts, it's important to read the fine print, because that lower cost of borrowing comes at a cost, which in this case, if they did indeed seize certain parts of the airport, is potentially a high one.
Okay. I want us to look at another aspect of your work that has to do with the BRICS. You've tracked some of the work BRICS has been doing around Africa. Do you think BRICS as a multilateral institution, will it be able to replace the IMF and the World Bank in Africa? Because there are a lot of arguments around that both institutions has been exploitative towards Africa. So do you think BRICS as a new form of alternative will be able to provide what many people across Africa are anticipating, a break away from the World Bank and the IMF, which will result into higher growth in economic and productivities?
So I think ultimately the goal should not be for the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, to replace the World Bank and the IMF. The ultimate goal should be to provide an alternative. African countries, when they are seeking project finance, when they are seeking debt instruments, it is always better if they have a variety of choices, because the World Bank will have their standards, the IMF will have their standards, and the New Development Bank will have their standards. So at least there are a range of options to consider for any African country that is seeking debt, and they can consider what is most appropriate. Unfortunately, no debt comes for free. So it's about understanding the circumstances under which these instruments are going to be extended and understanding which one is most appropriate. And sometimes the higher the cost of the debt, the more flexible it is. The lower the cost of the debt, the more constraints there are. And this has traditionally been a huge complaint in terms of IMF packages and World Bank packages. And there is some merit in this if the IMF and the World Bank, as a non-elected institution, are effectively giving mandates to the elected government of a country in terms of what to do. So this is perhaps the danger in terms of the devolution of democracy away from the elected representatives of the people, but to a group of people that are far away from the country. But the argument is and perhaps this is where there has been an evolution from the structural adjustment packages of the 80s and 90s, is the support and the guidance and the monitoring and the way that the IMF and the World Bank couches the kind of assistance that it provides. So it's less about giving sort of directives as to what to do, but to increase the transparency of what is being done, and that is an important step in the right direction.
I want us to talk about Pan-Africanism or Pan-Africanist ideas. In recent time, we've seen a growing political changes across Sahel, where Burkina Faso has nationalized 8 mines, as well as kicking out the French troops. Not just in Burkina Faso, this has been a trend across the Sahel, like Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, all of whom have also kicked out the French troops. Could we say that confrontation can we say that confrontation can achieve what 60 years of negotiation could not achieve in Africa, by bringing all of them together, all these stakeholders together, to align their visions and their goals together in terms of what they want to achieve for their specific countries?
So there are 2 key pieces here that I'd like to pick out of that conversation, or that question that you posed. I think the first one is that we must be very, very careful not to sensationalize movements. I think perhaps politically, it is expedient for the governments of the Sahel region to say that they kicked out the French. In reality, my understanding is that this has been a managed withdrawal of French military intervention of these countries over time. I think that it's the French state has been a very heavy actor in that part of the world for a very long time, and I think both sides recognized that in order to maintain stability as far as possible, a managed withdrawal of those kinds of interventions was required. But it does feed into the individual political narratives of the governments of certain states to say that they kicked out the French. And that is what would have been, sort of circulated in news and press. It definitely caused a frisson of panic in certain financial communities, until it was understood that we needed to separate the political narrative from the managed intent that had been there all the time. So I think it is important to underline that. But a second, and maybe linked to that, is the fact that united action is always more powerful than individualist action. But the challenge, even in regional bodies, has been to find points on which all member states can align. So you'll find, even if you look at the Moa region, or the Union of Central African States, even the SADC region, geographically, these countries may be similar and share borders, but in terms of their national interests, they are often very, very different. And the biggest challenge across the continent for regional bodies, never mind continental bodies, has been to settle on an agenda that is seen as beneficial for all member states, and not seen as the perceived agenda of a singular actor that is perhaps more influential than the others. And I think that is the strength and the weakness of all of the regional bodies in the African continent. There's generally one member state that is the lion's share of that economic union, and is perceived to push their agenda more strongly than the others.
If you are just joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion, I'd like to encourage you to please support our podcast by subscribing, liking, sharing, as well as recommending individuals to us that are doing remarkable works across the African continent. We'll try our best to bring them to this podcast to discuss the critical roles they are playing, either in research, in advocacy, or in politics. We'll do our best to highlight their efforts on this podcast. I want us to look at the African Continental Free Trade Area. Do you think it will be able to end up the dependency in Africa? But on the other hand, I'm also confused, because you see, its secretariat was being funded by the Chinese, as well as it received significant funding from the European Union. Do you think it is a Trojan house?
It's a very good question. I think that we need to be aware of the fact that there is political expediency to be seen to be funding some of these projects, and the understanding that the project itself will take many, many years to be realized. So with the African Free Trade Agreement, there are huge strides that have been achieved, given the ambitiousness and the enormity of the project itself. But it is the initiative itself is seeking to change the behaviors and the infrastructural networks that have been put down for decades. So definitely it is a project that from an international relations perspective, from a political perspective, is seen as the right thing to do. But a skeptic might say that both the EU and China do not necessarily feel that they have much to fear from this initiative being a significant challenger to existing trading agreements. That's not to say that it won't succeed. There are many challenges that have surprised incumbents across many, many industries and across many, many parts of the world. I think what is the not to unravel, though, is which comes first, because infrastructurally, African countries are set up to export to countries overseas. They're not necessarily set up to trade with one another. So there is an enormous amount of rail network that needs to happen, because road infrastructure, although it exists, it's very expensive to maintain, and it can't take the volumes that would be required to redirect the volumes of intra-African trade that the African Free Trade Agreement contemplates. And there's also just habits. There is spending habits. There is mindset. Here on this continent, we have this terrible tendency to think that the quality of something is better if it comes from overseas, and it's a tendency that has existed for decades, and it's a habit that is hard to break. So you need to believe that Ghanaian chocolate is better than Belgian chocolate in order to change those habits. Just as a small example, ironically, the cocoa beans probably come from the same place, but it's changing those consumer mindsets that will ultimately be the most powerful thing and the most important one.
This podcast is proudly sponsored by McKnight's clothing brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page. Their link is in the description of this video. In the 80s, like I said in the introduction, in the 80s, Thomas Sankara warned us that debt is a new colonialism that is trapping African countries. Fast forward today, the debt keep climbing, and we are no longer trying to be able to resolve this debt issue. Every time African countries are going to borrow money. So who actually wins this issue? Who's really winning? Is it Paris or Beijing or Washington, D.C.? Or is it the African politicians that are actually winning?
The short answer, all of them, and none. I think debt is a constant. I think we must be very careful to say that no debt is important. We need to reduce debt to zero. Debt is important because it does serve a function in terms of economic growth and in terms of investing for the future. I think the biggest problem is that the way as we were talking about right at the beginning of the podcast, so debt does have a function within economic processes and economic growth. The crux of the matter is the conditions that are attached to that debt. Ironically, if we want to look at indebted countries, some of the countries with the highest debt rates in the world are actually Japan and the United States. But because their economies are in a different context, and because the States in particular holds the reserve currency of the world, these problems affect them less than in the context of an African country. Because if you were to take the debt statistics of America and plant them on an African country, they would be downgraded to default status immediately. But that's not the case with the US, because that's not the way international economics works. So I think it is important to understand that debt statistics seem worse in the context of many African countries because of the way that those metrics are interpreted, and because of the fact that in many cases African countries have less agency over the strength of external factors on their economy. And I think that's a key issue. So that's why the debt piece becomes so important, particularly if debt is, as it is in many cases, extended in hard currency, because that also has an impact. If you are America or Europe, hard currency is the currency of your nation. If you have to introduce currency mismatches and the hard currency challenge to countries that do not have a hard currency as their domestic currency, then the problem is exacerbated. So again, debt is important, but too much debt or too many onerous circumstances in terms of how that debt is extended is very much an issue. I think that, and it's that delicate balance, because I very much doubt that there will ever be a world where the IMF and the World Bank are not required, where there are nation states that will not have trade packages and foreign aid as part of their foreign policy. We're seeing the withdrawal of US aid across many countries on the continent at this point, under the current Trump administration, but these things are cyclical. So this may well be the case for the next 5, 10, who knows, 15 years, but it is unlikely that it will be a constant. The trick is managing the debt, both in terms of diversity of sources. So in terms of African countries, making sure that they're not overly dependent on a single source, and also managing the tenor, so short-term debt versus long-term debt, the currencies, and also the conditions under which that debt is being taken on.
I'd like to ask you about the role of young people. With all of these issues going on around Africa, you see high cost of inequality, poverty. You see young people trying to travel through the Mediterranean Sea to come to Europe to see vision that they don't believe. They saw, to live a life that they saw over the internet. So what do you think young people should do at this point to be able to reduce some of those things that are happening across Africa?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the first thing is to believe that you can make a difference. I think one of the biggest challenges that this continent faces is that a lot of people become so overwhelmed by what they feel needs to change that they give up, and they move somewhere else and say, let it be somebody else's problem. And if enough people do that, then the continent is even more impoverished, because their real power, this continent's real power and real resources, it's people. And we've seen, there've been a couple of waves of repats that have come back and have made incredible differences in their communities and in their countries. Because, and it's a very similar story. They go overseas to find a better life, and get a fantastic education and an amazing experience, and something calls them home. And in doing so, that's where they make the difference, because they bring back that experience and that worldview, and they recalibrate it to the local circumstances of where they came from. And I think that is a really, really powerful thing. And I think that's the most precious thing that this continent has, is that of young people bringing their experiences home.
Okay, this will be my final question to you. Do you expect me, what may be your final thought? Maybe you have expected me to have asked a certain question and I didn't ask, something that you like to brush on. Could you do that, and then we can end the interview?
So I think I think one of the themes that I think that should always be brought up in the context of China, the West, and Africa is the idea, and it's a big theme at the moment, is the idea of being able to sift through information and misinformation. Obviously, with the Trump administration coming through, this has become, fake news has become, something we talk about all the time. But it's, disinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, has been around for a very, very long time. And the way that information is shared has become much faster. It's become it's become much more omnipresent and omnipotent. There are so many channels to the point where it's almost become confusing. And my biggest worry is that I think that we as human beings are losing the power of critical thinking. So we outsource a lot of our critical thinking to devices and to apps. And we may at some point get to a point where we can't actually critically analyze the information that is in front of us. We see a headline, we retweet it. We see it, we see a meme, we pass it on without necessarily looking at it ourselves and deciding whether it's actually worth it, passing it on, whether we agree with it, or whether we believe the sources of that information. And this is not a new problem. It's a problem that's been around as long as storytelling has been. It's just a problem that I think we need to reapply ourselves to, because the speed of information and the volume of information that we are forced to process on a daily basis is enormous, which is why now we have tools to help us do it. But we do need to become a lot more careful about the information we read, the information we believe, and the information we think is worth passing on.
This brings us to the end of today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. It has been an absolute honor to have you share your knowledge with us. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, we encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, comment, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members. Stay engaged, stay informed, and remain unapologetically African. Until we meet again, stay blessed.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.